everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today I would like to revisit a subject that I have not talked about in a very long time, and that would be doing BDSM under the influence. Now, you may not know this, but I talked about this actually in a video 4 or 5 years ago now, and that got absolutely tanked by the algorithm. Like literally 4,000 people ever have seen that video, and I think this is a really important topic, and there are some areas that I wanted to revisit and address that I didn't get to do in that original video as well. So this is going to be sort of an update because I do have some new experiences and new thoughts that I want to share. And this, I think, is a really important topic because probably at least once a week, I get someone who wants to know, is it safe to do BDSM when you're high? Don't most people do BDSM when they're drunk, etc., etc.? And I want to have kind of one video that I can direct everyone to and answer as many questions as possible. So we're going to talk about what is typical for a BDSM venue, how common being drunk or high while doing BDSM is, if it's safe or not, how to maybe engage in it in a safer way, and also, especially one thing I wanted to touch on I didn't before, is medication in this conversation, because I did not get to that at all, and how medication and medical disclosure maybe gets into this realm of engaging in BDSM as well. So first of all, the first thing I want to address is what is typical for a BDSM venue. What do most people do? And I want to compare and contrast my experience in the American BDSM scene with my experience in Europe, in particular in the UK, because there does seem to be a cultural difference depending on where you're at. So for example, in America, which I am more familiar with, you really don't see drugs or alcohol at BDSM parties. It is usually against the rule for there to be alcohol. You cannot show up if you are obviously drunk or high. They will not allow you in the door. They are pretty strict about that because it becomes a safety liability issue. Now, I do know there are some venues I have heard of in California, in Texas, where they are bars that are also BDSM venues, and so they are both charging you a ticket price to go to a BDSM event and then also providing you and selling you alcohol. And I have thoughts about if that's actually a good idea or not, but it's definitely not common. I would say 95% of BDSM venues, at least in America, are going to be dry. They are not going to have any kind of substance use at them. And one thing that people get confused about is in the leather community, which is a particular subset of BDSM that is more traditional, that intersects a lot with like biker culture, for example. They have a lot of parties that involve things like cigars, things like drinking whiskey, and kind of having a little bit more of an informal approach. I have actually gone to a number of leather events, and typically the cigar and whiskey social, or some kind of other name related to that, is almost always just a social. There is no actual play going on, but maybe people are kneeling and doing some service things, and it's really about just like talking and meeting with people, not doing like heavy whipping and bondage and things like that. When I have gone to a cigar and whiskey party at an actual BDSM dungeon, usually they are outside at private homes, etc., so not really at actual like venues like I'm mostly talking about here. When I have gone to those before, the way they have it set up is when you go in, you can say, I'm going to be drinking or I'm not going to be drinking. And if you choose to drink, you get an armband you wear for the remainder of the party, and that indicates to DMs that you are not allowed to play at the event. You can socialize, you can talk, you can carry on, but you can't actually get involved in doing the BDSM. So that is more typical for a BDSM dungeon. Now, there are other types of BDSM events where drinking is more common. So for example, at a munch, right? There is a subset of munches that can be called sloshes, which are hosted at a bar and tend to be something where older members of the community gather. And those are less common. Also, some munch venues do also offer alcohol and do have drinks. And so you will see people get sort of casual drinks and socializing, but not to get drunk. I don't think I've ever seen a drunk person at an actual munch before. It's not common. It's about, again, that social hour, just talking to people, getting to know people, not like, woohoo, we're here, let's get wasted, right? That's not really the environment. I would say the most common place you would be likely to see being drunk overlap with BDSM would be at a fetish night. If you are in the industrial scene, if you're into like EBM, if you're into goth music, you've probably seen this before. So a lot of venues that cater to like alternative crowds or like the darkly inclined, right? There will be fetish nights where you have a crossover between this kind of music and dancing at a bar and also having a theme of fetish wear, possibly some BDSM performances, possibly some places to do BDSM, but that is less common. And so in that sense, it's more of a party that happens to have BDSM as a theme versus it being a BDSM event first, you know, where you go there and the purpose is to play. It's more about seeing and being seen. And honestly, I have been to venues like that. If I go there, I don't drink, or I drink very little, enough to sort of, you know, just barely be tipsy but not actually be fully drunk. And that is really how I enjoy those parties and those events, though I haven't been to one in several years now, and they are certainly far less popular than something like a leather event that's whiskey and cigars or going to an actual BDSM dungeon, but they are out there and there is more of an overlap. And transitioning from what is common in America into what is more common in Europe, what I see in Europe, or my limited experience there at least, has been more like that last example, where it is like a rave or a club night or a party that happens to have BDSM at it. And over there, drinking is way more common. Like, I remember I went to a torture garden party, and pretty much by the time people got there, they had already been drinking, and a lot of people were already fully drunk, like pretty soon into the party. And for me, part of the reason why I don't encourage drinking or doing drugs or being under the influence when you are at a party involving BDSM is it makes consent very blurry. This was a venue, and I've told the story before, and I know Europeans are going to be mad at me for telling this because they always are, but it's the truth, it's my experience, is this venue literally had floor to ceiling signs everywhere in every room that said, no means no, only yes means yes, do not touch people without their consent. I was touched at that party numerous times by people without my consent. They were like getting really close. They were rubbing up on me. I wasn't even facing them, and they were like petting my head and touching my latex. And like, oh my God. It was like, as an asexual person, worst experience of my life ever at a BDSM venue. I have never, honestly, felt more violated in my life. And part of the reason why that happened is because everyone there was drinking, especially the people that were touching me and didn't even think to ask about consent, because everyone being drunk and kind of just like, I don't know, doing drunk people touchy-feely things was normal and accepted, and that's why they had to have the fucking floor-to-ceiling warning signs everywhere, and was not a positive experience for me. But drinking is much more common over there. I have had other partners in the past and people that I know that are from the European BDSM scene tell me that drinking in general and playing is much more common, and it is treated as like a lubricant, basically, if you will pardon the pun, I suppose, that allows people to feel more safe and more ready to engage in BDSM, even when they might be feeling nervous or feeling apprehensive. But it also means that people are less likely to know to respect scene space or know how to touch people appropriately. Like, it just makes things really messy. And so the next thing I want to talk about is why I don't encourage being under the influence while doing BDSM, because there are lots of reasons for this. Obviously, I have already touched on the consent issue as far as people that are drunk not necessarily understanding fully other people's boundaries and not necessarily knowing how to ask for those boundaries. That's one aspect of it. Also, it's really hard to not only receive and ask for, but also give consent when you're drunk, because when you are drinking, your prefrontal cortex is going to be not fully functional and not necessarily be fully thinking about the long-term repercussions of certain things. And that's kind of what you have to do if you're going to choose to engage in BDSM, especially with a stranger. If your ability to comprehend if someone is a safe player or not, or if this is something you actually want to do or not, is dampened because you are under the influence, you are more likely to end up in a dangerous situation. And I know a lot of people do want to have sort of the liquid courage of being able to drink and, feeling like, okay, well, I can't really do this unless I'm drunk. I feel like that's a bad place to be in because eventually you do end up being sober again. And when that happens, that can lead to regret, right? You can maybe negotiate for or ask to do something when you're drunk that you later regret when you're sober. And that's not a position you want to put yourself in. You want to have your full faculties available when you are negotiating with someone, when you are evaluating them as a potential play partner, when you're deciding, long term, is this kind of thing okay for me? And when you're under the influence, making those kinds of decisions is much, much harder. Now, aside from the consent aspect of things, the other part is it changes how BDSM feels. People do BDSM typically because they like the way BDSM itself makes them feel. They like the fact that BDSM gives them warm, happy feelings or intense pain or intense sadness or whatever else. And when you are under the influence, that can change, and it can change pretty drastically. So if you are a masochist and you want to do a pain-based scene, typically for most people, things like being drunk on alcohol will deaden your response and those things won't feel so intense, which means as a masochist, you may not enjoy them as much. And also, if you are not a masochist, it can mean you end up going too far in a way you later regret because you didn't intend to push the envelope with pain that much, and maybe you have all these bruises and other things that you weren't anticipating. It can also be the case that mentally your senses are more deadened as well. So maybe you don't get the same kind of emotional high. Maybe you don't get the same kind of experiences, or it's just harder to stay engaged. Like, for the people I know that choose to engage in BDSM sober, all of them are like, I don't know why I would want to do this while I was drunk. Why would that be appealing? Because if you are already altering your mental state going into something, it's going to be much harder to get that same kind of experience that you would get when you were sober. Not to mention the fact that it's kind of like a double complication of consent when you are dealing with both being drunk and being under the influence of having done BDSM. That makes things like in-scene communication, renegotiation, all of that very, very questionable and a lot harder. Being able to remember safe words, being able to remember safe signals, knowing what to do for aftercare. Also, things like the fact somebody could be so drunk, they could throw up, they could pass out, it gets a lot more dangerous to engage in BDSM once you add in those factors. Now, all of that being said though, some people still want to do certain types of BDSM when they're drunk. It is a common thing, for example, with consensual non-consent or CNC. And if you are going to play in that area, if you are going to try BDSM when you're going to be drunk, the way that you do that is with someone that you know and trust, that you have played with extensively, in a controlled environment that you are also familiar with, and you don't negotiate for what you're doing when you are already under the influence. That is the key thing, right? You negotiate for what you're going to do while you're sober. You talk about it. You talk about all the possibilities. What happens if I pass out? What happens if I vomit? What happens if I don't remember? What happens later? What happens if I black out? You have to talk through and think about all of those things. And you should still set up a way to communicate in scene and revoke consent in case you do get to the point when you are starting to feel drunk or get tipsy and you're like, whoa, actually, this doesn't feel safe to me. You still have to have the option to be able to revoke consent. And then you get into a safer way to engage while under the influence. It is not safe necessarily, but it is safer than going to a random bar you don't know, playing with a stranger in the secret upstairs dungeon, blacking out, not remembering what happened, waking up with bruises that you don't know how you got, and not getting any aftercare and having a double whammy of sub drop and also a hangover. doesn't sound like a fun time to me. So I would not necessarily say that I would encourage people to engage in that level of CNC play, but a lot of people are into that idea. And I think you just have to be able to really trust that person. If you are a more experienced player, if you really, really know what you're doing, if you have tried out all of the elements of the scene before sober, and you know they're not going to give you, or can guess at least based on while you're sober, they're not going to give you any kind of unexpected triggered response or something like that. At the end of the day, what you have to do is be able to fully understand the risk of what you are choosing to engage in and accept that those things might happen, even if you plan for them not to happen, right? Are you okay with the possibility that you might pass out and hit your head on something and get a head injury? Are you okay with the possibility you might vomit on your favorite piece of leather? Are you okay with the fact that someone that you trust might still take advantage of you? Right? All of that is part of the calculus that you have to do for yourself, and I can't necessarily do for you. Just really, really be careful and take your time. Don't rush into this. Really think about it, and that's really the best you can do. Now, I want to say this because I said something and I realized people might interpret it in a way that I didn't intend for it to be interpreted. It is not your fault. If you are under the influence, you're drunk, you're in subspace, whatever, any altered mental space, it is not your fault if someone takes advantage of that and manipulates you and coerces you and does bad things to you that are against your consent, right? You trusted someone, they violated that. That is a violation against you. Do not blame yourself if that happens. But it is a risk that is a potential possibility when you are engaging in those edge areas, and that's why I brought it up. So I've talked really a lot about being drunk in this video, I guess, because I am less familiar with any other kind of psychoactive substance. But I do also want to address in this medication and BDSM, because something I saw on that video, I think either someone commented on it or I had a later conversation about it. Something that people don't address in these conversations is the reality that a lot of us are on so-called mind-altering substances on a daily basis because of conditions we might have, right? Maybe we have to take Adderall every day or Xanax, or we are on a really heavy-duty pain medication for a chronic pain issue. And some people also use those same drugs as a way to get high, even when it is not part of their everyday life. It's really just something they use as a recreational tool. However, when I am really talking in this video about being sober versus being under the influence, what I'm really talking about is your own personal baseline for what your brain is most used to operating in. So if for you, you take Adderall every single day, that is your baseline. Some people may not consider that to be sober, I guess, but that is your baseline, and it's deviations from that baseline when you are getting into the territory of needing to think in additional ways about how that affects consent and negotiations and the overall safety of engaging in play. Now, I am certainly not an expert on medication or how these things affect individual people, so you have to use your own judgment, but I do want to acknowledge that for a lot of us, we are on things that maybe would be called mind-altering substances that aren't necessarily affecting us in the same way as somebody getting like super drunk on the weekend and then deciding to go play with a stranger. Now, there are some areas in here that I didn't quite get to, and I realized one thing I did is I didn't necessarily talk a lot about the topping side of how being under the influence can affect you. So if you are under the influence while being a top, you might think, oh, well, that's not nearly as dangerous because, they can't violate my consent. It's not like I'm going to like throw up and pass out in bondage and then, vomit and be wearing a gag and then choke on the vomit and that's not my problem, right? Well, when you're a top, it can definitely still affect you. It can affect your aim if you are throwing an implement, putting your partner in danger. It can affect your reaction time if something goes wrong. Like, I cannot imagine doing a suspension as a top while drunk and then having to cut someone out of the rope. Anytime you are doing a risky BDSM activity, adding being under the influence on top of that, even as a top, makes it that much more dangerous. Because part of being the top during a scene means that you have to be very aware that things could go wrong quickly and you might need to take action. And that could literally be seconds of difference between things being like a little bit of a scary accident and being tragically bad. And when your reaction time is lessened, when you are not as aware of what's going on, that can lead to some really nasty consequences, or even just being able to hear your partner say a safe word and staying in touch enough to have that sort of stronger nonverbal body language communication to say, hey, like, are they still enjoying this? Am I hitting the right spot? If you are off in your own little world because you're under the influence and you are not really there present in the moment, that can make it a lot harder to fully comprehend what exactly it is that you're doing, or knowing when to stop, or remembering what the safe word is, or knowing how to take someone out of cuffs and being coordinated enough to do those kind of mechanical actions like more complicated flogging, or taking someone out of a pair of cuffs, or tying or untying rope. Both as a bottom and as a top, you can be really affected by being under the influence, and you shouldn't necessarily think you get a free pass just because you are the one that is topping during the scene. Also, one of the reasons why I think people should be careful about choosing to be under the influence in a BDSM space or going to a BDSM space where drinking is normal is because, honestly, oftentimes, those are spaces for predators. Because what predators do is they find someone that's maybe younger, less experienced, seems kind of shy, is hanging out by the bar and kind of sipping a drink. Then they go up and they're like, hey, what's going on, sweetheart, or whatever. I don't know how they talk. But they say something like that, and then they serve them more drinks. And they buy them another drink, and they flatter them, and they talk, and they get them to really be focused on them. And then suddenly the person is really, really drunk, more drunk than they ever intended to be, and the person that got them there can take advantage of that. And that is scary as shit to me, that could happen in a BDSM space where someone could then be tied up or whipped or have their blood drawn or who even knows what else, because someone took advantage of a situation where manipulation was made much easier for them because of what was allowed at the venue. And of course, obviously, DMs should be careful to recognize that if they are at a play space where those kinds of things are happening, but it's not a safety guarantee. So if you're younger, if you're newer to the scene, if you have less experience, I would be very careful about the venues you choose to visit and what you do at them, because unfortunately, there is that risk that somebody is there on purpose to take advantage and push something in their favor, shall I say, keeping it as PG as possible for the algorithm. So, I think with all that being said, let's summarize what we've talked about here today. So first of all, there are differences in what different areas of the world consider to be normal for engaging in BDSM. In the US, being sober is really the standard, whereas in Europe and in the UK, the standards might be different. However, I do not encourage people to play while under the influence when they do BDSM because it can cause a litany of problems, from issues with consent, slurred speech, not being able to remember safe words, increased danger for doing certain types of play like bondage, wearing gags, the risk of vomiting, not being able to remember what happened, or passing out and hitting your head on something. Besides that, it can also deaden your reaction times, make you less aware of what is going on, being able to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing, or remember what you negotiated for. And also, it can mean that you sense things differently, probably usually in a worse way, and you aren't as mentally aware of what's going on, and so BDSM can be less enjoyable. However, despite all of that, a lot of people do choose to still engage in BDSM or want to try BDSM while under the influence. In such a case, I do recommend that you only do it with people that you know and trust, doing things that you have already tried before and that you know you can fairly easily tolerate in general, and also that you keep in a way, despite all of that, to be able to revoke your consent during the scene itself, and just be really careful to thoroughly negotiate beforehand when you are still sober, and also that you are aware of all of the things that could go wrong that you are having to take on as a risk when you choose to engage in play when you are under the influence. So that is sort of my summary of everything. I hope that you all enjoyed this. This is certainly a complicated and contentious area of BDSM, but hopefully you can see why now I don't encourage you to play when you are under the influence. I do think that BDSM is more enjoyable and safer when you are sober, but of course everyone is going to do their own thing and I cannot control everyone, and so hopefully this will give you some more information to hopefully help you make better decisions for yourself. I would love to know what you all think about this in a comment down below. I am sure all of you have lots of different experiences and opinions, especially if you are elsewhere in the world besides in the US. If you have not already and you want to make sure to not miss out on any other videos from me, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And if you want to make sure to really support what I do, the best way you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.